April 23rd, 1995. New Smyrna Beach, Florida. 8-year-old Dimitric Moore tells his mother, Ora Lee Moore, that he is going out to visit a friend, but fails to return home that night. The following afternoon, Dimitric's nude body is discovered in the trunk of his mother's car, and his cause of death is determined to be asphyxiation. Months later, Ora is indicted for voluntary manslaughter after she is accused of drowning Dimitric in her bathtub, but is acquitted when she goes on trial for the crime. Rumours circulate that Dimitric may have actually been killed by some kids who bullied him and his body placed in Ora's trunk in order to frame her, but no one else is ever charged for Dimitric's death. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be exploring a heartbreaking case which was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, the 1995 death of Dimitric Moore. As you probably know, due to the recent events which have been taking place in the world, The Trail Went Cold has spent the last month covering unsolved cold cases in which the victims were persons of color. And depending on your point of view, today's story might actually have two victims: an 8-year-old boy who was murdered, and a mother who may have been falsely accused of the crime. Like I just mentioned, this case was once featured on Unsolved Mysteries, and I consider it to be one of the more underrated cases from the show, but sadly the segment is currently not available for viewing on Amazon Prime or YouTube, so there may be a number of fans who have never even heard of this one. Anyway, Dimitric Moore went missing after leaving his house to go out and play, before his body turned up inside the trunk of his mother's car the following day. Naturally, his mother Ora became the prime suspect, and she was eventually indicted for voluntary manslaughter, but the case against her at trial proved so problematic that the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before they found her not guilty. Since a number of witnesses had seen Dimitric being bullied by some other neighborhood kids prior to his death, there was speculation that they may have been responsible for what happened, and some adults helped cover the whole thing up by diverting suspicion towards Ora. Whatever the case, even after Ora was acquitted, the local authorities still maintained that she was guilty and closed the investigation, but a number of people believed that they developed serious tunnel vision and never brought the real perpetrators to justice. So we're going to explore both sides of this controversial case on today's episode. Anyway, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the unsolved death of Dimitric Moore. Our story begins in 1995 in New Smyrna Beach, Florida, a town which had a population of around 18,000 people at that time and is located in Volusia County, just under 15 miles south of Daytona Beach. Our central figure is Dimitric Moore, an 8-year-old African-American child who is currently living in a duplex with his 37-year-old single mother, Ora Lee Moore, who works as a nurse's aide, as well as his 21-year-old brother Damon, and Ora's boyfriend, Anthony Wright. Dimitric is considered to be a very bright, precocious, well-behaved, straight-A student attending second grade at Reed Patillo Elementary School. He is also taking karate lessons at a martial arts club and has managed to attain his red belt. At around 2 p.m. on the afternoon of Sunday, April the 23rd, Dimitric asked his mother if he could go out and play with one of his neighbors, a boy named Raymond, and Ora gave him permission to do so. About an hour later, Ora left to drive her niece to a church meeting and returned home at around 4:15. By the time nightfall hit, Dimitric had still not returned home, so Ora went to check with his friend Raymond, but was surprised to learn that Raymond and his father had been out fishing all day and never saw Dimitric. Ora said she was not overly concerned yet, because she figured her sister-in-law might have met up with Dimitric and taken him shopping with her own kids, but when he did not turn up by 9 o'clock, Ora called the New Smyrna Beach Police Department to officially report him missing. Ora was scheduled to work an overnight shift at the Ocean View Nursing Home, which began at 10:30, and even though Dimitric could still not be found, Ora went to work as planned, though she kept trying to get in touch with her sister-in-law. By the time midnight arrived, Ora learned that Dimitric was still missing, so she decided to leave work and go searching for him. At one point, Ora and her other son Damon were driving through the neighborhood in Ora's Nissan Sentra, and when they pulled over and climbed out to continue their search, they were approached by 2 neighborhood women who told them that Dimitric had been seen getting into a fight with some boys near some abandoned houses next to the railroad tracks. The women escorted Ora and Damon to the spot where this incident allegedly took place, but they found nothing. Anyway, over the course of the next day, a massive search effort would be launched for Dimitric, as his family, the neighbors, and the police would continue to comb the area for him. During the afternoon, Ora was being driven around in a friend's vehicle to continue searching, but when she returned home at around 4 p.m., she discovered that the police had sealed off the driveway, and she soon received some horrible news. Dimitric had been found dead. Just under 20 minutes before Ora arrived, Damon had opened the trunk of her Nissan Sentra while it was parked in the driveway in order to put some items inside, but he wound up discovering Dimitric's body. Dimitric was nude, and his wet shorts were resting in the trunk beside him. Since the vehicle had been left unlocked, it was initially speculated that Dimitric might have crawled into the trunk and accidentally locked himself inside, where he suffocated from the heat. However, when an autopsy was performed, there were a number of signs which pointed towards foul play. The medical examiner determined that Dimitric had been dead between 18 to 24 hours before he was found, and while there were no signs of sexual assault or molestation, he had a number of bruises on his face, head, arms, lower back, and the bottoms of his feet. In addition, there were marks on the top of his feet, which may have been cigarette burns, but otherwise, Dimitric's body was so clean that it seemed like someone had recently bathed or showered him. The medical examiner would eventually announce that Dimitric's exact cause of death was asphyxiation, and he was the victim of a homicide. Over 400 mourners would attend Dimitric's funeral, where the reverend presiding over the service stated, quote, "Dimitric had accomplished in 8 years what some never accomplish in much longer lifetimes, bringing people all across the city and on both sides of the tracks together," end quote. Instructors from Dimitric's martial arts club posthumously awarded him an honorary black belt and presented it to his mother. But of course, given that Dimitric was found inside the trunk of her car, Ora became the primary focus of the New Smyrna Beach Police Department's investigation. Over the next several months, Ora would be questioned and interrogated numerous times and given 3 polygraph tests, of which she wound up failing one of them. While Ora continually denied any involvement in her son's death, investigators noticed a major red flag when journalist John Holland interviewed Ora and published an article about Dimitric's case in the June 29th edition of the Daytona Beach News Journal. During the article, Ora was quoted making this statement, quote, "Anybody who knows how I love my baby would never imagine that I would choke him or smother him or drown him while he would be flailing and yelling," end quote. Well, by this point, investigators had formulated a theory about Ora drowning Dimitric in her bathtub, but the problem was that they had not released this information to the public. As far as they knew, Ora had only been told that her son's cause of death was asphyxiation and drowning was never mentioned. On the basis of this new revelation, a Volusia County grand jury investigation was convened in August, and over the next 4 months, they would hear numerous pieces of evidence and testimony, in order to determine whether or not there was a strong enough case to charge Ora with Dimitric's death. By this point, Ora was receiving death threats and had hired a defense attorney named James Kroc, who agreed to represent her free of charge. On December the 18th, Ora herself was called upon to testify in front of the grand jury, but Kroc stepped in and brought a halt to it, believing that the grand jury's frequent interruptions and barrage of questions were depriving Ora of an adequate opportunity to tell her side of the story. Kroc told the press, quote, "The only way she can fully explain her innocence is before a trial jury where defense evidence and witnesses can be found and a neutral judge will preside." End quote. Well, later that same day, the grand jury elected to indict Ora on the charge of voluntary manslaughter. The case would be prosecuted by Volusia County State Attorney Stephen Alexander, who stated, quote, "This is not a murder indictment. Someone died of a mistaken action or gross negligence. It was not intentional and not premeditated. We believe the boy died of gross negligence." End quote. Since Ora had no prior criminal record, she was released on a $2,500 bond, which was raised by a number of friends and supporters who did not believe she was guilty. In fact, one of Ora's neighbors and closest friends was the head of the Southeast Volusia chapter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and he had nothing but glowing things to say about Dimitric and Ora, telling the Orlando Sentinel, quote, "He never had a bruise or complained when he was at my house. She was a loving mother, and he was a very, very good boy." End quote. Ora's trial would begin in May of 1996, and she was represented by public defender Matt Phillips. If convicted of voluntary manslaughter, Ora would have faced a sentence of between 3 to 7 years in prison. The scenario presented by prosecutor Stephen Alexander was that Ora became enraged when Dimitric returned home on the evening of April the 23rd, not only because he was late, but because he was very dirty as well. Ora responded by running a bath, but was so angry that she violently threw Dimitric into the water and slammed his head against the tub. While she may not have intended to kill Dimitric, Alexander theorized that Ora stormed out of the bathroom and returned a few minutes later, only to discover that Dimitric had fallen unconscious and drowned underwater. In response, Ora completely washed her son's body before taking him and his wet shorts and placing them inside the trunk of her Nissan. The medical examiner would testify that the placement of 5 of the bruises on Dimitric's head, which ran from his neck to the back of his skull, were consistent with being slammed into a bathtub, and the bruises on his arms may have been caused by him hitting the sides of the tub while he struggled. He also believed that the scrapes and bruises on Dimitric's feet were consistent with him being dragged while his body was moved to the trunk, and testified that foam which had been found in Dimitric's mouth was consistent with drowning. The prosecution would also present the testimony from 4 boys who claimed they had been playing with Dimitric in the neighborhood until nightfall before they went their separate ways. 2 of the boys said they rode by Dimitric's house on their bicycles while Ora was standing outside, and told her Dimitric would be home shortly, which prompted Ora to yell that he was in trouble. A 3rd boy claimed that he accompanied Dimitric while he rode home on his bike, and saw him entering the house at around 7:45 p.m. Since Ora called the police to report Dimitric missing at 9 o'clock, his death and her attempts to cover it up would have taken place in a window of just over 1 hour. Ora denied that this alleged exchange with the 2 boys ever took place, claiming that her other son Damon was with her at the house during a large chunk of this period of time, and that she only would have been alone for a window of about 20 minutes. However, the prosecution pointed out that Dimitric's shoes and bicycle had been found at his house, which seemed to support the idea that he returned home that night. The prosecution played the recording of the phone call when Ora reported her son missing, and pointed out how strange it was that she phoned the police department's regular, non-emergency number rather than calling 911. A new Smyrna Beach police investigator testified that when he spoke to Ora, she sounded unusually calm and did not respond to direct questions. During the call, Ora said she had been to all of her friends' homes to let them know what was happening and that they were looking for Dimitric, but a number of neighbors testified that Ora had not yet told them her son was missing. One neighbor also reportedly saw Ora arguing with Damon in the yard about 10 minutes before she made the call. The prosecution also found it unusual that Ora decided to show up for her shift at the nursing home at 10:30 while Dimitric was missing, though Ora maintained that she may have been fired had she not done so. Ora's fellow co-workers did testify that she seemed visibly upset when she showed up and told them that Damon was remaining at the house in case Dimitric came home. However, one employee claimed that when she asked Ora if she had checked inside the trunk of her car for Dimitric, Ora told her she had already done so. In addition, another co-worker testified that when she expressed her condolences towards Ora at Dimitric's funeral, she responded, quote, "Well, he spent the day doing things he shouldn't be doing, but he is in heaven now," end quote. Of course, one of the state's key witnesses would be reporter John Holland, who interviewed Ora and specifically heard her deny that she drowned her son, even though the information about the drowning was not yet public knowledge at that point. Well, Ora's defense team countered this evidence by presenting a videotape of Ora being administered a polygraph test on June the 14th, 2 weeks before her interview with Holland. The video showed the polygraph examiner presenting Ora with a scenario about her drowning Dimitric in the bathtub, which provided a potential explanation for how this idea entered Ora's head and why she denied it. The defense also poked holes in the prosecution's theory about Ora flying into a violent rage and killing Dimitric, as they lived in a duplex where the dividing walls were very thin. Indeed, Ora's next-door neighbors testified that it was not uncommon for them to be able to hear the family's conversations through the walls. But even though they were at home between 7:45 and 9 p.m. on the evening of April the 23rd, the neighbors denied hearing any yelling, loud noises, or anything suspicious to suggest that Ora had become angry or violently attacked Dimitric inside the residence. The defense also brought in a forensic pathologist to debunk the medical examiner's claim that the bruises on the back of Dimitric's head were consistent with having been slammed into a bathtub, testifying that there was no way to specifically determine if bruises were caused by a bathtub. The pathologist also made sure to reiterate that on Dimitric's actual death certificate, the medical examiner listed the cause of death as asphyxiation, not drowning, so it was never conclusively proven that he drowned. The most shocking revelation which occurred during the trial was when the defense tried to discredit the testimony of the 4 boys who claimed they saw Dimitric return home by alleging that the boys themselves may have been involved in his death. On the afternoon Dimitric went missing, there were a number of adult eyewitnesses who reported seeing him play basketball with these boys, which technically would have made them the last people to have seen Dimitric alive. In fact, 2 witnesses reported that on 2 separate occasions that afternoon, they saw Dimitric being bullied by the other boys, and one of the witnesses said that the oldest, largest boy was holding Dimitric to the ground and forcing him to eat dirt. During the early stages of the investigation, these boys were interviewed by police and claimed that they had not even seen Dimitric that day, but later changed their stories and admitted they had been with him. One of the boys said he lied because he feared the blame would be placed on him for Dimitric's death. Of course, the defense believed that this caused some serious credibility issues with the boys' testimony, and believed that if they were responsible for Dimitric's death, they would have enlisted the help of one or more of their parents in order to cover the whole thing up. Remember how when Ora and Damon were searching for Dimitric, and they were approached by 2 women who took them down to the railroad tracks because Dimitric had allegedly gotten into a fight with some boys there? Well, Ora left her Nissan Sentra unattended and unlocked the entire time she was searching there, and since the vehicle had a push-button release near the driver's seat which opened the trunk, she suspected that someone used this opportunity to plant Dimitric's body in there and frame her for his death. One of Ora's neighbors also claimed that while she was driving through the neighborhood on the afternoon of April the 24th, one of the aforementioned boys had flagged her down and told her that Dimitric had been found beaten to death near the railroad tracks. But the problem was that this exchange took place 2 hours before Dimitric's body was discovered inside the trunk. For her part, Ora agreed to take the stand and testify on her own behalf, and even after being cross-examined for more than 2 hours, she maintained her composure and never wavered from her original story. Well, in the end, the jury believed there was more than enough reasonable doubt that Ora was responsible for the death of her child, and after deliberating for less than 2 hours, they found Ora not guilty of the crime. Following the verdict, Ora told the press, quote, "I just want to find out who killed my baby." Well, in spite of this, the new Smyrna Beach Police Department still maintained that they got the right person the first time around, so following Ora's acquittal, they officially closed the case, refusing to explore any further leads or continue the investigation. However, later that year, Stephen Alexander would lose the election for Volusia County State Attorney to John Tanner, who decided to reopen Dimitric's case in February of 1997, assigning the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, an independent agency, to conduct a new investigation. 3 months later, the story would be featured on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and after the initial broadcast, approximately 36 phone tips were received by the show's telecenter. But unfortunately, these tips never led anywhere, and after failing to turn up any substantial new leads, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement would bring an end to their investigation by the end of the year. After 25 years, no one else has ever officially been charged for the death of Dimitric Moore. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. Anyway, like I mentioned in the intro, I consider this to be one of the more underrated Unsolved Mystery segments, as the case has never really gotten much discussion online, and of course, it's currently not available for viewing on Amazon Prime or YouTube. While Unsolved Mysteries aired their fair share of final appeal segments about cases in which someone had been convicted of a crime, and there was doubt about whether or not the appellant was actually guilty, this story is rather unique, because it featured a defendant who had been charged with a crime and was acquitted at their trial. Obviously, if a person is found not guilty, double jeopardy prevents them from ever being charged with the same crime again, even if new evidence surfaces, but of course, just because a person is acquitted does not necessarily mean they're innocent. The people who originally worked on this case still maintain that Ora Lee Moore was the guilty party, but the jury's decision to turn her loose was out of their hands, so they felt there was nothing left to investigate. However, the newly elected state attorney felt much differently, which is the main reason this case was reopened and got featured on Unsolved Mysteries. Now, my first impressions upon watching their segment was that the state's case against Ora Lee Moore was incredibly weak, and during her interviews, I thought Ora came across as genuine and sincere, and I believe that she really wanted to find justice for her deceased son. Once I started researching the story for this episode, I wondered if I was going to come across any additional information not mentioned on Unsolved Mysteries, which would have raised some red flags about Ora and painted her in an unflattering light. But that really did not turn out to be the case at all. Everything I've read about Dimitric indicates that he was a very good, well-behaved boy who did well in school, and I could not find one negative story about Ora. To make a comparison, you might recall the episode I released a few weeks ago about the unsolved disappearance of Tamra Keepness, a 5-year-old Indigenous girl from Canada who hailed from a very dysfunctional household with a history of child neglect, drug and alcohol usage, and numerous documented visits from social services. So you can understand why many people suspect that the child's own family might be complicit in her disappearance. But there's nothing whatsoever to indicate that Dimitric was living in a broken home, as there was no documented history of abuse or neglect, and everyone who knew Ora described her as a loving mother who worked hard to provide for her family. In fact, even though they lived in an area which was known for having issues with drugs, Ora was described as being very cautious about protecting her children from that. She really did not fit the profile of a mother who would suddenly snap and kill her child just because he was dirty when he arrived home. It's also worth noting that Ora was charged with voluntary manslaughter, not murder, and even if she had been convicted, her sentence would have only been between 3 and 7 years. If Ora had pled guilty and avoided going to trial, her sentence may have wound up being even shorter than that, so I get the sense that she genuinely wanted to clear her name. Now, if Ora was not responsible for Dimitric's death, I guess another potential theory might be that his older brother Damon killed him, as he was the one who found Dimitric's body in their mother's trunk, and he can be placed in the household during the approximate time period when Dimitric was killed. Yet I was unable to uncover anything negative about Damon either. Shortly after Dimitric was born, Ora wound up being stationed with the US Army in Germany. She said that during that time period, Damon would sometimes ditch school and travel several miles home just so he could cradle his baby brother. Ora also had a live-in boyfriend named Anthony Wright, and while there's not a lot of information out there about him, Ora did say that Anthony had a great relationship with Dimitric and loved the child as if he were his very own. So if there were any issues in that household at all, Dimitric's family must have kept them very well hidden. Of course, I can definitely understand why the police focused on Ora as a suspect, since Dimitric's body was literally found inside the trunk of her car, but I also think this gave them a serious case of tunnel vision and prevented them from focus on other potential leads. I think it says a lot about the case against Ora that the jury took less than 2 hours to find her not guilty, as it's very uncommon for juries to reach verdicts that quickly unless the case for guilt or innocence is pretty clear-cut. One of the jurors was interviewed on Unsolved Mysteries, and she made it sound like the jury did not vote to acquit simply because they felt the state hadn't proved their case beyond a reasonable doubt. I get the impression that they legitimately believed Ora did not do it. In fact, in the weeks following the trial, many of the jurors were interviewed by the press, and they openly expressed their disappointment about the New Smyrna Beach Police Department's decision to close the case and not pursue other leads, which seems to indicate that they truly believed the real killer was still out there. It sounds like the piece of evidence which most influenced the jury's verdict was the testimony from Ora's next-door neighbors at their duplex, who were at home during the alleged time period of Dimitric's death, yet did not hear anything suspicious at all through the super thin walls, even though the case was based around Ora going into an angry, violent rage and killing her son. And unfortunately, it sounds like the only thing which turned out to be thinner than those duplex walls was the prosecution's case. The one piece of evidence which prompted investigators to take this case to a grand jury was Ora's interview in the Daytona Beach News-Journal, where she specifically denied drowning her son, even though no one had publicly mentioned drowning as a cause of death. Yet they completely forgot, or just outright ignored the fact, that a polygraph examiner had proposed this drowning theory to Ora 2 weeks earlier, which came back to bite them when a videotape of this was played at the trial. If that's what you were using as one of the linchpins of your case, then you just don't have much of a case. Of course, another issue was that there really wasn't any conclusive evidence that Dimitric even drowned in the first place. Remember, the medical examiner ruled that the exact cause of death was asphyxiation, and while he did testify about finding some foam in Dimitric's mouth, which was consistent with drowning, it's odd that there's no mention in any of the initial reports about any water being found in Dimitric's lungs. It sounds like they used Ora's allegedly incriminating statement during the interview, as well as the fact that Dimitric's body was freshly washed and cleaned, to formulate this drowning in the bathtub theory months after the fact, even though the evidence didn't really support it. In regards to the other evidence against Ora, most of it was incredibly weak, such as her supposedly not sounding urgent enough during her call to report Dimitric missing. They made a lot out of the fact that Ora went to work her shift at the nursing home shortly after that call, but Ora did say she would likely get fired if she didn't show up. It sounds like she was still holding on to the hope that Dimitric might be out shopping with her sister-in-law, but when Ora found out that wasn't the case, she left her shift after working less than 2 hours in order to search for him. I know one of Ora's co-workers testified that Ora told her she had already searched her car trunk for Dimitric, but remember, Ora believes that someone planted Dimitric's body in her trunk after she left the nursing home to go searching for him, so even if the co-worker was telling the truth, that detail might be completely irrelevant. And while we're on the subject of Dimitri's body in the trunk, if Ora was actually guilty of this crime, she would have to be one of the stupidest criminals ever, because there's no logical reason for her to keep Dimitric in there for nearly 20 hours. After she reported Dimitric missing, she drove to work, left less than 2 hours into her shift, and spent a good chunk of the night searching for him, so she would have had ample opportunity to remove her son's body from the trunk and dispose of it thoroughly enough to ensure he would never be found. Dimitric also happened to be discovered the following afternoon when Damon opened the Nissan's trunk while Ora was out searching with other people. Why would Ora willingly leave her unattended car parked in the driveway if she knew Dimitric was in the trunk, particularly since it had a push-button release and could be accessed by anyone? There also appears to be confusion about the marks on the tops of both of Dimitric's feet, as some of the initial reporting said they were cigarette burns, but the impression I got from the medical examiner's testimony at the trial is that these marks were scrapes caused by his feet being dragged when his body was moved to the trunk. Ora was a smoker, so if those were cigarette burns, you can see why people might suspect she made them, but the prosecution's theory was based around Dimitric's death being accidental when Ora slammed his head underwater in the bathtub, and I'm not exactly sure how burning his feet with cigarettes would fit into the scenario. It's almost as if the state decided to downplay this detail once they realized it did not completely fit their narrative. Now, the key piece of evidence, which was used to support the prosecution's theory, was the testimony of the 4 boys who claimed that Dimitric returned home at 7:45 p.m., even though Ora maintained that she had not seen him since around 2 o'clock that afternoon. But as we're going to discuss momentarily, this testimony may be problematic for a number of different reasons. I definitely think that no matter who was responsible, Dimitric's death was probably an accident, and the alternate scenario pushed forward by Ora's defense team is that a group of neighborhood boys who testified against her may have killed Dimitric in an act of bullying which escalated out of control. Now, talking about this part of the case is tricky, as all these other boys were minors, and since their names have never been released publicly, specific details are a bit vague. The angle with the boys being the real perpetrators was heavily emphasized during the Unsolved Mystery segment, but looking back at the original newspaper coverage of this case, there was very little reporting done on their testimony at trial, because once again, they were minors, and I'm sure the media needed to protect their privacy. However, I do have to acknowledge that they may have intentionally perjured themselves in order to send an innocent woman to prison. In the defense's eyes, the biggest red flag was that these boys initially denied being with Dimitric on the day he went missing, and it was only after a number of witnesses reported seeing them together that they shared a new story about hanging out with Dimitric until nightfall before watching him return home. The line would be problematic enough, but when you also take into account that some of these witnesses said the boys were bullying and roughhousing Dimitric, this paints a very unsettling picture. One witness even claimed that Dimitric was being held to the ground and forced to eat dirt, and well, that's especially interesting when you consider that his cause of death was asphyxiation. So it's not hard to imagine a situation where things escalated out of control. Following the trial, the jury openly said that they believed the testimony from the boys sounded coached, and one detail which convinced them that their story wasn't legitimate was when one of the boys said he saw Dimitric enter the house through a sliding glass door, as a crime scene photo showed that a massive bookcase had been blocking that particular door. They also did not believe the boys' account that Dimitric rode his bike home that day. While the prosecution had emphasized the fact that Dimitric's bike was found on the porch, which supposedly proved that he did return home, one police officer who saw the bike testified that it was very rusty and looked like it hadn't been ridden in quite some time. Now, when Dimitric originally left the house that afternoon, he told Ora that he was going to see a friend of his named Raymond, but when she spoke to Raymond later that night, it turned out he and his father had been out fishing all day. This seems to imply that Dimitric lied to his mother about where he was going to be that afternoon, and from what I heard about him, it sounds like that would have been very out of character. So I have to wonder if this means that the boys Dimitric was seen hanging out with were not kids his mother would have approved of. I mean, there were eyewitness accounts of these kids bullying him, and it sounds like at least some of them were older than Dimitric. And apparently, one of the boys told Dimitric's neighbor that he had been beaten to death near the railroad tracks 2 hours before his body was discovered, which matches what 2 women told Ora while she was searching for him during the night. So was Dimitric really killed near the railroad tracks, or was this just an intentional act of misdirection to distract from what really happened? Now obviously, a group of kids are not going to have the wherewithal to wash Dimitric's body and place it inside the trunk of Ora's car, so if they were responsible for what happened, they obviously would have had to enlist the assistance of some adults, presumably their parents, to cover the whole thing up for them. From what I understand, even though Dimitric's wet shorts were found in the trunk next to his body, the t-shirt he had been wearing that day was never found, so I wonder if they had to get rid of it because it contained incriminating evidence. Ora has theorized that Dimitric was placed in her trunk during the time period when the 2 neighborhood women accompanied her and Damon to the railroad tracks while her vehicle was left unattended. Even though this has never been confirmed publicly, I have read rumors online that these women were the mothers of 2 of the boys involved in Dimitric's death, so this very well could have been an intentional diversion to lure Ora away from her car. At some point, the boys were then coached into fabricating a false story about seeing Dimitric return home in the hopes that his mother would take the fall. So here is an interesting detail about this case, which has only come out in recent years. In December of 2018, CNN published an article titled Perry Baker, How an Unsolved Murder Inspired Rugby Stars NYPD Internship. In case you're not familiar with him, Perry Baker is considered to be one of the top rugby players in the United States and was a member of their national team at the 2016 Summer Olympics. During his interview for this article, Baker discussed a recent summer internship he had with the New York Police Department SWAT team and revealed that the aforementioned unsolved murder which got him interested in law enforcement was the death of Dimitric Moore. You see, Baker actually grew up in the same neighborhood in New Smyrna Beach and stated, quote, "When I was younger, this kid I was friends with, Dimitric Moore, was murdered, and that case was never solved. The last time he was seen alive, he was at my house. I was 8 years old, and I had to go to court. I had to go to the witness stand, and I thought, man, I want to catch whoever did this. I want to catch bad guys." End quote. Well, at first, I wondered if this meant that Perry Baker was one of the 4 neighborhood boys implicated in Dimitric's death, but if he was, I'm not sure why he would be talking about it publicly. After all, their names were withheld from the public because they were minors, and given that he's gone on to have a very successful career, you'd think Baker would be a bit more tight-lipped if he was involved in a murder. So it's possible that Baker was called upon to testify at the trial for other reasons and was nothing more than Dimitric's friend. However, here's another interesting piece of information about these boys. There's a post about this case on the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit I'm always referring to, and it features a comment from a poster under the username Jinx76, who claims that they lived in New Smyrna Beach when this crime took place, and was one of the witnesses who saw the 4 boys bullying Dimitric on the afternoon he went missing. They claim that an adult intervened to break up the altercation, and after they dispersed, Dimitric started walking home and was never seen alive again. Jinx76 believed that the police botched the case because they put all their focus on Ora, but perhaps the most interesting claim they made was that 2 of the 4 boys are currently on death row for quote-unquote child abuse-related deaths of their own children. Well, needless to say, that's quite a far cry from playing on the US Olympic rugby team. I decided to take a quick look through the profiles of death row inmates in Florida, and while I'm not going to make any guesses, I will mention that there are a few inmates currently housed on death row for committing crimes in Volusia County who still would have been kids at the time Dimitric was killed. It's a horrifying thought to consider that some of these boys may have gone on to commit more murders after getting away with what they did to Dimitric. However, since we still don't know these boys' identities, I'm not going to speculate on that. This is a fairly unique story for The Trail Went Cold, because I don't believe we have covered too many other unsolved cases in which the perpetrator or perpetrators may have been children. If new evidence did surface, which proved that these boys were responsible for Dimitric's death, how exactly would the legal situation be handled, considering that they still would have been minors at the time this crime took place? As I'm sure you know, one of the biggest controversies in the true crime world during the past several years are the accusations that John Benet Ramsey's older brother, Burke Ramsey, who was only 9 years old at the time, was responsible for her death, and their parents covered up the crime in order to protect him. And putting aside the issue about whether or not these allegations are actually true, this opened up a lot of debate about the ethics of publicly naming a suspect who may have committed a crime when they were still a minor, especially if it was the parents who made the decision to cover up for them. It sounds like similar allegations have been made here, though this case is nowhere near as high profile, and unlike Burke Ramsey, the identities of these alleged perpetrators have never been disclosed publicly, and they have not had to go on living their lives with a cloud of suspicion hanging over their heads. The situation here is quite murky because it's still not clear which of the boys' parents may have been complicit in covering up the crime. For all we know, some of these kids may not have actively participated in killing Dimitric and were just bystanders who witnessed it happen. Given that Ora would have only faced 3 to 7 years in prison if she had been found guilty of this crime, I think it's safe to assume that if Dimitric's death was legitimately an accident, and these boys had come forward and admitted what they did, their punishment would not have been that severe, and since they were minors, their identities would have been shielded from the public. But it's possible that decision may have been taken completely out of their hands, as the adults in their lives were the ones who decided to orchestrate a cover-up, frame an innocent woman, and coach the boys into perjuring themselves in court. So after all these years, it might be difficult to determine the full culpability of who did what. It's possible that some of these boys were just bad seeds and went on to commit additional crimes, but it's also possible that some of them just moved past the whole incident and went on to live normal lives that they're still living today. But no matter what happened, that doesn't change the fact that a bright, well-liked boy had his entire future stolen away from him. Anyway, I don't get the impression that this case is still being actively investigated, and I also have no idea how Ora Lee Moore is doing today, but I think she deserves to have her name completely cleared and for her son to receive justice. So if you happen to have any information on the death of Dimitric Moore, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We produced a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and this past month, we released an episode on a final appeal case from Unsolved Mysteries about the controversial conviction of Steve Shores, a young resident from Chicago's South Side who served time in prison for the murder of a security guard, but maintained that he was framed by the real killers. Sound familiar? And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've also recorded another new audio commentary track which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. So to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are AMW, Emily C., and Brianna C. Thank you all so much for your support. And before I bring this episode to a close, I would like to play a promo for another true crime podcast, Riddle Me That.
Hey Trail Went Cold listeners, if you are a fan of this show, then I know you will love the brand new podcast, Riddle Me That True Crime. It covers mainly unsolved international cases. The host, myself, comes from an academic background and loves to dive deep into cases. Those cases that don't seem to have a clear resolution, such as the disappearance of Upali Wijewardene, formerly Sri Lanka's richest man. He disappeared in a private plane over the Straits of Malacca. No trace of the passengers or aircraft was ever found. Was it an accident or an assassination? Listen and weigh in for yourselves. During these strange times, it's comforting to have something entertaining to listen to. Who knows, perhaps you can help solve a mystery. Riddle Me That True Crime is on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and wherever you listen to your podcasts.
I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play Music, or Spotify. So have yourself a good week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.